planet. So this is Malacandra, and it's really, as we find out and Ransom finds out in the reading today, he finds out officially, of course, that it's Mars, but there are certain characteristics that are applied to each of the planets according to the geocentric model. The Ptolemaic universe had within it, each of the planets, certain characteristics that were given to the names of the planets, which are named after the Roman gods. So Mars is the god of war, but he's more than the god of war. And Mars in the model has lots of characteristics that aren't attributed merely to Ares, who we understand is the Greek god of war before Rome calls him Mars. So we're looking for characteristics within the world that tell us something about the planet. Of course, this all comes from Michael Ward, who uncovered this in his book, Planet Narnia, that essentially each of the Narnia books are taking place on one of the planets. And so the Martian planet book is, I believe, Prince Caspian. And so you see all these characteristics of Mars and that. But in this book, this is also Martian. What we determined was martial about the characteristics were not simply violence, but what we might call, for lack of a better term, manhood. So it's not violence alone, it's determined dutifulness to a cause. It's not about war, it's about being resolute, firm. And it's also about a spirit of kind of brotherly community in which they're pursuing, and this is evidenced in the hunt for the Nakra, the species of all the Hrossa go out and they hunt for these, almost like a whale hunt. And Ransom, as an outsider, as a human, he participates in this, and he himself feels him growing and becoming grown. I think he says that he's become something. What he's really become is a grown man. So we kind of talked about that, and then we talked about it in terms, I think, of Ransom being a single bachelor, in that he's unattached, he's alone. It's part of the reason that he's chosen to go. He's captured and taken because he's alone. No one will miss him, and the intent, as he understands it, is he's going to be sacrificed. That's why he's taken in the first place, because they need a sacrifice to give to the beings who live on Malacandra, his two companions, Devon and Weston. So we talked about each of those two characters as well, but I think that kind of summarizes what we got to in the first half of the book. Is that about right, or is there something that I'm leaving out? Pretty good.
Yeah.
There were questions about the fallen nature and whether or not, whether, I think it was a question that was posed, which was better worded than this, but it potentially that, would there be death without the fall? Was life meant to go on forever, even pre-fall? Which is worth thinking about, because that theme comes up again later. And the person who brought out that comment, he hadn't read the book yet, so he kind of either is prescient enough to skip that sense, or just was curious enough to give a really good question and something for us to think about. So one thing we didn't get to talk about, even though we read the chapter, we didn't get to talk about pleasure. There's a whole bit in chapter 12 about pleasure. I thought was really interesting and worth reading. And then Steve had things from the beginning of the book that he mentioned post discussion. He said there's some killer lines and killer ideas in the opening of the book, and we kind of skipped right past a lot of that and just got right into where they land. But he might have wanted to start there, and maybe we could recover that, talk about pleasure, and then move into the second half of the book talking about some of the events that happened there. So what was the thing that stood out to you most, Steve, that you said, like, there's a lot packed into the beginning that maybe is worth just kind of putting it on our minds? Because I know I judge it, this is inappropriate, but I judge a book's chapters rereading this based on how many highlights and marks and things that have it. And I just didn't have a lot in that first didn't have a lot in the first 2 chapters really. So to me, it's all kind of set up for the big ideas, but maybe I'm missing something and I don't want to miss it. What were you seeing early on that you thought kind of Lewis leaves us really set up for what we're about to get into?
Yeah, the classical standard for great literature is called logographic necessity, and it comes out of the Phaedrus, Plato's Phaedrus. And Socrates' claim is that every speech, and in this case, fictional work or whatever, literary piece, is like an animal. It's like its own species. And as such, one, it has to have everything that's needed and nothing missing. And 2, it can't have any extraneous parts, like you don't want your cow to have a 5th leg, coming out the side or whatever. And then the thing that's, everything that's there needs to be there. There are no extraneous parts. And that you can see is a really, really high standard. And I never really thought of Lewis early on. Like when I was in college, I said, Lewis is a great, Christian thinker. And then I went to grad school and I went, oh, Lewis is just a great thinker. You don't have to attach the special little Christian, caveat to that. And then I never really thought of his writings as having that classical standard of logographic necessity and so forth. So, but I think that opening, I think it meets that standard. I think everything that's in there, if you don't know why there's a thunderstorm, if you don't know why he's under a chestnut tree, if you don't know why you have this bursting of yellow, and why he's alone, and then how on earth he gets roped into all these, into the problem that he has, then it's usually with Lewis I don't really care, but I feel like if I'm reading Homer or the Aeneid or whatever, then I just know I don't know, and I basically need to keep poking around and trying to think about these things. So I don't know that I've cracked the whole thing open, but I do think that all of those details, I think that the problem of modernity as Lewis perceived it is really articulated in the Abolition of Man. And I think this trilogy in its entirety is intended to in one way undo the problems that are there, in another sense set humanity back on its path. And in the broadest sense, I think it has to do, and it's yeah, I don't want to, this is not a lecture time or whatever, but so from that perspective, I think that the opening of Out of the Silent Planet alludes, it sets up in narrative form what Lewis considers to be the problem. So the more you understand Abolition of Man, the more you see that what he's dealing with there in a kind of symbolic way is, best case scenario, what do you get out of modernity? You get somebody like Ransom. He's a decent, pious guy, alone, kind of detached, not much community, survives the war, because he talks about it. This war that is horrific, right? And so, yeah, so I would say, and then the whole question with the Abolition of Man is the radical change in the view of science from natural philosophy to modern science. And I think this really comes to really a clear thing in the hideous strength. When we get into there, the whole thing is just screaming the problem of modern science and so forth. But yeah, so those are the things maybe one indication of this, I would say, is yeah, just to focus on one thing. I don't want to dominate all this kind of stuff, but how does he get roped into this thing? And he gets roped into this thing despite the fact that he gets angry with himself, because a relatively unintelligent mom is worried about a considerably unintelligent boy. And these are the kind of people that Weston would just as soon eliminate from humanity. I think they're an embarrassment to humanity. And as we'll see, Weston wants to take, and especially as we get into the third book, there's a whole group of people that want to take humanity. Or you just think of it in terms of abolition of man. At some point, technology goes from conquering nature outside to some group of people choosing how they're going to redefine humanity. And Ransom has the human decency, kind of the inarticulate. It's not a philosophical system. He has the common decency to care about this mom and look at, and he knows they're not very intelligent. And in fact, he gets angry with himself because he doesn't want to get all involved. So that would be like one indication among many. The whole idea of nature, the thunderstorm, what's going on there, the roads turn into rivers. There's just raises questions about what is the nature of nature. And then as we saw here in this particular half of Out of the Silent Planet, you get into the whole thing about,
Sorry.
No.
Can you wave? You waved everybody? Do you say goodnight?
Do you know the nature of nature? No,
Well, she's potty training now, so she's got that. Right? Yeah.
She's like, who are these faces?
Right. Wave good night.
Good night.
Good night. That's good. So anyways, yeah, so the nature of nature, and then these three little people groups, they're all, now or whatever. That's all super fascinating stuff. And then I would say my sense is that you're dealing with masculinity, a recovery of pre-modern masculinity in Out of Silent Planet, a recovery of genuine femininity in Pfifltriggi, and then let's talk about marriage. Third book is about marriage, right? So you're going to recover marriage, a high view of marriage, which we know is just getting completely trashed, right? You can see this in the culture today. So, okay, I did my work for tonight.
So when I knew you raised those questions before, the first chapter didn't make sense to me until his trek. I cannot remember the name. The oyster dude, their version of God, I guess is the best way to put it.
Oh,
When he's
Yarsa?
on the trek. Yeah, when he's on the trek. So he just killed the whale, the animal, and they did not obey yeah, I cannot do names today. So yeah, he goes on this trek, and what was interesting is there seems to be more of an embracing of responsibility connected to the camaraderie that he has. And then even though he's displeasured by the natural forces issues, the cold, the atmospheric conditions and all that, he embraces it more than he does in the first couple of chapters. It's like almost exact polar opposite between the beginning and the end. And I know that some of that's character development, but it seems to make the latter half of the book seems to make the first couple of chapters say more than I thought. Just okay, here's the beginning of the story and how it all began.
Yeah, that's really great. I think you're right. There's there's the ordering of chapters and ideas and kind of getting us to the point where we hit the climax. And then, there's the return journey, as most, if not all, space related travel requires for us to see the protagonist return back. But yeah, he comes back obviously quite changed. And we did mention that. I think that's another just a quick summary of something that we talked about last week, was the idea of this Ptolemaic universe, the medieval cosmology, has a different sense of space than what modern science has given to us. So modern science sees and calls it space, like the idea of emptiness between other things. But the ancients called it the heavens, the place where God and the presence of God is and where spirits dwell. And so that's like one of the main ideas that's kind of running through here. And that's what gives Ransom, unknowingly at first, the sense of comfort when he first leaves Earth's atmosphere, is that he's feeling the rays of the sun. He's in the place where he can be communicated with. He's in the communicative world. And the reason that he has not felt that on Earth is because Earth is fallen. And we find that out in the second half of the book. And that's, of course, referring back to the fall of the bent one, who also, as it turns out, affects Malacandra as well. So Malacandra will pass in time too. The effects are not the same. They're not ruled. Their Oyarsa, their guardian angel, so it seems, is still in control. But Earth, Pfifltriggi, is under the spell of the one who has fallen, who we know as Satan. So we did talk about that. And so there's so much kind of wrapped up in the idea of space. It's interesting too, it's called the Space Trilogy, but Lewis himself, via Ransom, doesn't want this to be called space. He wants it to be called the heavens. So it's sort of an irony that it ends up being called the exact thing that he doesn't really want it to be. So therefore, you should all call it the Ransom Trilogy instead of the Space Trilogy, and that way we'll be more true to our author. But there was a really interesting bit. The three species Steve was mentioning earlier, we have the Hrossa, we have the Sorns, and we have the Pfifltriggs, I think. And each of them has a specific set of characteristics. And Hrossa, the first that Lewis meets, and he ends up finding a lot of common ground. One, because they are the speakers, and Ransom is a philologist. So he understands their language and can communicate with them. And so they are the speakers of the species too. They're the writers, they're the poets. I shouldn't say writers, because there's a distinction that's drawn there too. So Lewis gets into a place, keep saying Lewis. It's not Lewis, it's Ransom. Ransom gets into a place in which he is able to have really close conversations about many things with Hrossa. And one of those, and it was in, I believe, chapter 12, which we read last week in preparation, but we didn't get to talk about it, was this idea, and it connects to something that Stephen mentioned earlier about the Phaedrus, which is this idea of memory and remembering, and how remembering is in itself a kind of pleasure. It extends the sense of pleasure. So I'm not going to pretend to know much more about the Phaedrus than what I read when I was an undergraduate 15 years ago, because I haven't actually returned to it since. But I do remember that there was this idea about that if you have the ability to write things down, this allows you to be sort of forgetful, because it's always stored somewhere else. You no longer have to restore, you no longer have to access this point. You don't have to remember for yourself. It's in a book. And we can see this in our own lives all the time. If we put things down in a book, we don't remember when things are. And so in a sense, this act of remembering is more important. So notoriously the Hrossa don't write down their poems, they just remember them. And it gets into a conversation about pleasure, because Lewis is, someone stop me. Someone put like a shot collar on me from saying Lewis every time I'm talking about Ransom. Ransom is asking about, he's trying to find about the economics of Malacandra. That's what he's really interested in. He's trying to study their way of life and understand things about them. And he's trying to understand their relationships between their males and females, children, and to some degree another sex. And it comes up that the idea is that on Malacandra, people, because they desire pleasure, they will try to get that as much as they possibly can, even at the cost of having children that can't support too many children. And they're also teaching a lesson about remembering, and it's something I probably could pull the quote because I think it's quite helpful, I guess, in today's society too. My book, and again, I have this edition. I know there's a few editions, so the page numbers don't really matter in this case, but on my edition, it's the second page of chapter 12. And it may be interesting to interact with a few of these paragraphs before we move on to chapter 14. So second page of my book, but it starts with the line like this. A pleasure is full grown only when it is remembered. You are speaking, human, as if the pleasure were one thing and the memory another. It's all one thing. The Seroni could say it better than I say it now, not better than I could say it in a poem. What you call remembering is the last part of the pleasure, as the cra is the last part of a poem. When you and I met, the meeting was over very shortly. It was nothing. Now it is growing something as we remember it. But still, we know very little about it. What it will be when I remember it as I lie down to die, what it makes me all my days till then, that is the real meeting. The other is only the beginning of it. You say you have poets in your world. Do they not teach you this? I was just curious about your take on this idea of the act of memory and that a pleasure is only full grown when it is remembered. And the idea of holding things in our minds, that old idea of you know it by heart, that you're implanting something within you and holding it within you as a means of, why do we have children memorize scripture? Why do we have them memorize famous poems and famous speeches? Well, it's because we hope that that those things remembered will be a guidepost at some other point in life in which they can walk down these paths with this information there. But I found it fascinating. We didn't get to talk about it. And I think if anyone wants to talk about it, I'd love to hear what other people think about this bit.
It seemed to be an interesting parenthesis in the story. Like it's there for a reason, but for the whole book, it didn't seem to connect with me much. In terms of the plot of the story, in terms of the philosophical question you're asking, when you do enough grief counseling with people, particularly widows who've been married for 40, 50, 60 years, you see this played out totally, where they'll share about an experience, or they'll share about remembering the experience almost as being as unpleasurable as the experience actually happening live. So in terms of that thing, I'm thinking it's one of those things that we understand more. This could sound bad. You and I may not be old enough to fully understand that paragraph yet.
Thank you.
Now, we determined already that we're all very youthful here, and that there are none of us old enough to really get that paragraph. Hi.
Yes, but that's what I was saying by the you. I mean, sorry, y'all and I are not.
Yeah, if you tried to create.
That paragraph made perfect sense to me. Sorry, Micah.
If you tried to recreate like the best moments of your life, they would really fall short, right? Like whatever you think is the best, time in your life, or the best, whatever. Obviously, the best class that Miss Cagley has ever had, I was part of that. Best class she's ever had, I was part of that. If they just tried to recreate that all the time, it would just fall short. It wouldn't be quite the same thing. But the memory of the thing that was the best is actually far more enduring, far more valuable than trying to live in that present now.
Yeah. But I'd even push back, because like why we always want to try to say that we're young. Ecclesiastes says that there's disadvantages to being old, but the Bible overwhelmingly says there's advantages as well. And I think part of that is not just the pleasure of things, but when you have, well, you don't always have your memory completely intact, but there's things that really stand out. You see more of what is important versus what is not when you're older. right? So our ability to handle change is different. And sometimes it's just because you don't want to go through the cycle again. It's more of just an energy thing necessarily than we hate change. But I think there is value to age, especially, and I think a lot of people don't do this, but when you sit around, particularly a campfire with multiple generations, and you hear about the tales of older generations, that's something that young people cannot do that old people can. And it plays into the idea, the paragraph and the complete pleasure of the thing. And I mean, if I was to re-articulate it in our modern or semi-modern culture, rather than have that your poets taught you this is having the people around your campfire taught you this.
Yeah, it's the storyteller aspect. And you think about those stories around the campfire, the events that led to the stories are not nearly as pleasurable as the storytelling and the recreating, the remembering of those stories.
Do you think the Hrossa says that they haven't begun to understand their meeting because they both individually haven't lived long enough to rightly appreciate the aspects of it that maybe they'll see with age, or also because their relationship hasn't grown, so that as their relationship grows, their understanding of each other also grows? I'm wondering if it's all individual knowledge or the beginning of a thing itself that will grow.
Can you say that again in a slightly different way?
I'll try. Maybe it's not worth going this direction. But I was thinking about the fact that it's a relationship that started in their meeting. And he was saying that they will understand it when they remember it. And I was wondering if that had to do with their individual knowledge that would grow with their age, or if it was that their relationship would grow and it's that thing itself that the meeting started that would give them different knowledge.
I think it's a both and. Because with this whole process, I mean, when we're parents, when you look back at baby photos and your kids are teenagers and all of a sudden you start getting the feels like, wow, that went by way too fast. And you hear older people whose kids are, married off now, but we won't mention any names like Mr. Shoemaker's, that it just, you start seeing how things morph and change in the whole process that goes on. So I think there's an individual change, a knowledge component. But I think even with people who you've known who've passed away, as you get older, you understand it. Even though it might just be individual to you, it affects a lot of your other relationships and how you teach and interact with others. So I think it's a both and. I like your question.
I just wonder whether, this all certainly has social dynamics, but to me, the thing that catches my attention is the question of the nature of pleasure itself in any activity. And I wonder whether he's right. I kind of think he is. That whatever pleasure you feel in any activity in that moment isn't completed until sometime in the future you think back on it. And if that's true, you can see why there is a kind of moral component that's supposed to guide that pleasurable activity. I mean, it doesn't take much imagination to think of different cases where you can be older, reflect back and regret, or you can look back as older and find a deeper pleasure in the past.
It reminded me, not to bring up His Holiness's name, Jordan Peterson, but It reminded me of a speech he was given in relation to people saying no to kids. And he says, it's going to get awfully lonely when you get older. And the ramification of what comes next. Like, we're so stuck in here and today that we forget that we're, you know, if health prevails, you're going to be 60, 70, 80. And it would be nice to have grandkids around to spoil and keep you company to share these stories with.
I've heard that argument used. Gosh, how selfish to want someone around just to keep you company when you get older. By many people, dear friends of mine, when I ask them. I do wonder if the idea of people's memories playing into the fulfillment of and greater enrichment of enjoyment has anything to do with not remembering it exactly as it was, but with our own personal embellishments brought in. We tend to, with our memories, we tend to soften the harsher parts and really, you know, embellish the happy parts. Does that play into this at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, there's a certain inability for us to remember things, you know, perfectly accurately as fallen beings. I think that's true. So we're going to do that, and we're going to. I mean, maybe you've never done anything that you truly regret, but for me, I actually have sort of a kind of a tick that happens just upon thinking about something I said or something I did when I recall it. But even then, I still don't know that I fully realize, you know, the truly horrific nature of the thing that I've done. I still don't know that it's fully realized even at this point, but the memory of it certainly bothers me physically in a way that I respond, and then I can't continue on with it anymore. So yeah,
Well,
I think you're right.
Does that play into the idea of, is this a fallen world that we brought up last week?
Well, certainly, you know, there's elements of the fall in the atmosphere, right? We get that that they say toward the end of the book that this world's going to pass away too. It's not going to last forever. Whether that's merely an effect of a fall or that's by design, Lewis seems to be arguing that in the case as well. That there's many creatures. Soren's one of them say that who's to think that any race or species or world is meant to go on forever? All things must come to an end. Lewis himself, famous for saying in other places that you know, everything must die so that it can live that second life, that other life eventually. But you all have to die before you actually die, and so that there's this idea that death is just part of. In a very non-Eastern way of thinking, but death is a part of what it means to just be fully human and what everyone must experience. And so the species here are also seeing the sense that death is not a thing to be feared, which is one of the things that Ransom has to learn. It's one of his big lessons, I think, that he is not, that he needs to get over his fear of death, and he does that clearly. How he does that, though, is really interesting, and maybe we can get to the fear, because that's what comes up the first chapter of the assigned reading. That is in chapter 14. We get to that part. So this is after his friend, the first Hrossa he friends, is killed. Weston Divine shoot him from afar, and now death by weapon has come into the world, not by the Hernaka, the way that many Hrossa have died in the past. This is murder. It's brought in from a weapon. And this is a result we see because, as Ty mentioned earlier, Lewis was commanded by an Eldil to go visit Yarsa. He doesn't do it. He says to avoid meeting the Hrossa, he wants to go on with the hunt. He needs to find his manhood. And he successfully completes the hunt. They kill the Hraka. And but then his friend is killed. And so now he is sent in. And the Hrossa say he has to go on, and he does begin to go. And now his fears of what life on other planets is really like come back to him. Says on my page 86, again, the second page of chapter 14, something really interesting. He says, it would be strange, but not an inconceivable world. Heroism and poetry at the bottom, cold scientific intellect above it. and overtopping all, some dark superstition which scientific intellect, helpless against the revenge of the emotional depths it had ignored, had neither will nor power to remove. So again, this is Ransom going back into thinking of the H.G. Wells stories and thinking that all on other planets are going to be hostile toward him. And now he's going to meet this god of this planet and face some sort of judgment. And he's thinking again of, well, these Hrossa, they are poets and heroes. They're martial. So they're doing things that martiality would require. And I took part in that. But then above that, we have these cold scientific intellect, and above that, dark superstition. I wondered if there was some within that strata there, something that Lewis is getting at, a bigger picture about the idea of society, modern society, as Steve has mentioned earlier. The idea that the Pfifltriggs, the arts and crafts guys, the ones who are creators and inventors, and they come up with things, but not of their own making. Someone else tells them to do that. And of course, the Hrossa, the farmers, gardeners, hunters, but poets, they occupy this bottom sphere. And then you have separate from that kind of detached scientific reason that is over that. But above all of it, he says, dark superstition. I wonder if there's something within that strata worth discussing, or something that's bigger beyond just those terms themselves.
I'm not sure if he realizes, but that's Pfifltriggi. That's what he's left. What he's afraid that he's going to run into when he's imagining what the Seroni will be.
Do you have thoughts, Aaron, on this? This goes back to last week with the superstition.
So what's the dark mythology on top of all of it?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. But do you have any thoughts on how you brush out that?
No.
What is the superstition of the modern scientist, right?
Global warming.
Hi, this is recording. I don't know if you knew that.
We now can cancel you anytime we want that.
I find it interesting because I think we can see the three groupings. The culture I'm in now is the Hrossa. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who would be the Soren out in Boston, and she made an interesting comment about frustration, because she's definitely left of center, not left, but left of center. And I said, how would you propose to feed everyone in our country, and not just do it once, but to do it year over year? Like, how would you put that all together? And I think even in our discourse in our country, we miss the intelligence it takes to make that happen. There's a kind of intelligence to feed people, to transport it, to do it year over year. But what's also interesting is the way they talk is very poetic. It's very much by analogy and story. More so than when I was in Michigan. It was a combination of the technical trade people. I can't remember the C.S. Lewis's name, but it was a combination of half that and half the Soren, and just how they view each other. And it was just it's interesting to see Ransom's trek through all this and learning these three different categories or types of people on Malacandra. It's just interesting because it feels very much like my journey of the last 15 years of just seeing the different groups, but understanding the nuance and the importance of it, and not seeing it necessarily as superiority, but as fitting into an entire whole.
Why do you think Lewis has these three groups? What is he up to?
That's funny, because that was the question I was going to ask you.
Yeah, well, I think
And that they are not at war with each other at all. And Ransom tries to pull it out a few different scenarios. Yeah, but who rules? And there, nobody, only Oyarsa rules. And so it's really hard for him to understand that one of them is not superior to the others. So these three, maybe we could see them two different ways. They are three types of people that are necessary to society, but they're three different parts that are necessary to a being. But they're not in conflict with each other.
Well, there's really 4 parts, right? Not 3. Because you have the one who rules, and then you have the one who's the science, the brains, you have the one who makes things happen, and then you have the one that feeds everybody.
I was wondering if the one who rules is the separate and the other, though.
Because he says that
True.
the problem is that they all want to be Oyarsa, and it's impossible for creatures to rule themselves, right? So you have to go above the creatures in order to put each creature in its proper place.
When Denise said that was the problem calls Earth, where he says the problem there is that everyone wants to be.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, C.S. Lewis nailed that one.
I wonder too if these
Well-
are kind of archetypal. I don't want to get too much into archetype, but that
Right.
in our world, we mix and match these in very toxic ways or in ways that are confusing. And so he artificially takes these 3 fundamental human dimensions and separates them into people groups. They're all now, they're not for now or now, but for us to understand what they really should be like in our soul is to be able to see them distinctly separated out into 3 different groups, So science needs to be a certain way. And poetry and singing, being a warrior, all those things are the same thing. And you can't see that until you divide them out into a different group. And then the Pfifltriggi or whatever they are, Triggi, they're a whole nother group. And you can see that in the modern world, at least the 2 are put together. Well, this is a great paragraph on, for me, it's page 79, that you have this hierarchy. Poetry at the
What's
bottom.
weird is, because I'm getting back to your questions. I can't call you Steve. I'm sorry. To get back to your question as a shoemaker is the, so C.S. Lewis's Hrossa, if that's a group, that's separated in our regime, right? Our poets and all that, and storytellers are separated from, and actually look down at each other from those who do the food, the fishing, and all that aspect. Like it's very different, which I thought was interesting. I haven't read The Abolition of Man, so the connection you made there, I have to take your word for it. I am seeing or sensing that C.S. Lewis is trying to point that Earth is bent, to use the Hrossa term, and definitely fallen, where I cannot say all these names, I apologize. The planet that Ransom is on, that planet seems to be in the process of heading that way. So you have current harmony, but it seems like it's a fragile thing. So I think he has these 3 groups because I think he's trying to juxtapose the harmony. It seems like he's juxtaposing the harmony that once was versus the mess that Earth is. Not trying to archetype, but just in the context of the book, that seems to be what I'm seeing in the plot.
I don't think we see that Malacandra is fallen. I didn't pick up on evidence of that. And even I think it's in the funeral scene that it's explained that death isn't an evidence of fallenness here. I don't have the book in front of me though. I think it was that scene though that made me think, oh, death doesn't mean fallen.
Right. They've been impacted by the fall, but it's not like they're not under the realm of the fallen Ayarsa. They have a good one who knows Maladil and serves Maladil. So they have the right kind of person, but it's been affected. So when he fell, he struck Malacandra as well. And so there's some effect, but it's not fallen in the sense that Malacandra seems to indicate. So yeah, you're right. You're right, Aaron.
Yeah,
Yeah, the fall. Oh, go ahead.
That's okay. Go ahead.
I was saying when I was speaking to fallenness, when he was at the heights, oh gosh, I'm sorry about forgetting names and everything. The A dude that he was supposed to meet at the tower, when he was walking, he was explaining, he was explaining how things once were versus how they are now. So I'm not saying it was fallen, but that process has has begun on the planet. That's what I wasn't using death as referring to the fallen, but just the state of nature and explaining, and the presence of Ransom, Divine, and Weston.
I hear what you're saying, because the Handramit is the only place they live, and the name for the highlands is more or less uninhabitable, and it didn't used to be that way.
Right.
I wanted to piggyback off that. That's funny. Our comments were from the same thing. Ogre criticizes the Hrossa, and Ransom's not so keen about it. Well, I like
them.
I like them, and I like their view of death.
Their view of death is good.
What does he say though? I forgot.
Yeah, well, he
just
says that they don't fear
natural-
death. Oh, sorry, Aaron. Yeah, that they don't fear death is good, but that they are willing to pursue it, maybe unnecessarily. He goes, they'll go and you'll die up here, and they'll go write a beautiful poem about you, and then that'll be it. And then they'll remember that forever, and that's great. But you'll be dead. They unnecessarily put things in danger when there's a kind of common sense. There's a right and easy way to do things that they will avoid because they don't fear death. Not that they shouldn't fear death. They're happy that they don't. But that's not the end all be all.
Leading to the best line in the whole book. Here, little one, smell on this.
Yeah.
Right. And like only a Hrossa would send you up here without that. Of
Preparing
course,
you,
they wouldn't think of that.
Knuckleheads. So, but tucked away in there, I thought, is something that is really, it doesn't make sense to us, I think, from a theological perspective. But he says death is natural, and that's what the Hrossa don't understand, that it's natural. And
they think it's only glory, it's only one.
Yeah, they're fine with it. They can die. They're not able to see that there is a very unheroic aspect of death, that it's a natural part of the order. And that has huge, I mean, if you're really going to push the fundamental divide between pre-modern, postmodern, it's the harnessing of knowledge. It's the union of the Seroni and the Pfifltriggi. You turn science into technology, that wedding of the two, as opposed to keeping those divided. You combine, so I see it as science, art, and poetry. Those are the three. And you need to understand, you get to understand what each of those fundamentally are about by looking at those people groups and so forth. But modern world unites those two. It unites science. It thinks that science is technology. That's how it's sold. That's why you allow people to dig up bodies and cadavers and cut them open, because it's going to lead to toasters, good vacuum cleaners, and ultimately, but really in a more serious sense, it really, at least in the literature, it's an attempt, like Descartes, Discourse on Method. It's an attempt, it's the hope that you can overcome death. This huge artifice of modern scientific impulse is this attempt to refuse to see death as a natural part or as a curse. But I think it's interesting that Lewis has his, in this planet, in this context, death is natural. It's not a result of the curse, it's natural. And that somehow, for me, I think this is the fun. You see it in the book, right? I mean, you probably, I don't think ultimately that you have to go on a Hrossa hunt, to become a man. But you have to face death voluntarily under a moral cause, right?
I was thinking about through the story, I was wondering if there was clues that the hunt hadn't made Ransom a man yet, because the Eldil comes right before the hunt, and that seemed to be like a testing, and he was the one that chose not to follow the signs, like Jill Pole, and then the consequence comes right after the hunt, but he still takes up the false side. He's still, and it's the Hrossa that are the true side. And that made me think of their first meeting, where it seemed like he called it a courtship, but it seemed that Ransom took the feminine side of that courtship with the shyness and not the masculine side. Like looking at, so I've been just watching for when's the point, or maybe it's at many points, that he becomes a man. So is it when he's alone, the climb up the mountain? It's another significant feature of his journey.
Well, the hard part is when he's told to scram, and when the beast appears, happens simultaneously. Like when they're having the debate is when all of a sudden it was there. So they were left with, like, it's on now. But I would agree with you. I think when he takes responsibility for his actions in connection with the whole community and takes that track, that's when he becomes a man. Because when this friend dies and calls him the killer of the beast, I mean, that he has the title, but I think he acts out the title on his next trek.
I tend to think it's at the very, very end, when he knows he's going to die, and Weston melts, and he goes and he faces it, and he just prepares for it, and then he falls asleep. I think that's, and closely tied to that, I think, is when he's given the choice. Do you stay? And
I was thinking about that too.
Yeah, I think it's two halves, two sides of the same coin, where he deliberately chooses. So, and I think there's a huge difference, obviously, between facing death and being resigned to death. And being resigned to death doesn't make you a man. That's Weston. He's resigned to it, and maybe Divine too. But when they miss their target and they know it's over, then you get the meltdown. And Oyarsa says, well, this is either going to make you mad or make you a man, right? And I think he does it, right? He faces death. He goes back for a moral purpose, under a moral purpose. And then he faces it and he goes, well, either die now or in 30 years, but you're going to die. And he just calmly then says, well, a guy has to prepare himself, right? That's it. I can't think of a better way to put it.
Yeah, that's good. And I think it connects somewhat to one of your other questions that you had posted post last week's talk, which was the idea that in what sense are the fears that he is experiencing, how do they grow him and shape him and make him who he needs to be? So you get the fear of dying, the fear of death. That's one big one. But then there's this other sort of fear that he articulates as not being exactly fear, but this idea of being somewhat uneasy or uncomfortable with being fully known. And that seems to be one of the things that drives his divergence away from meeting Ayarsa, that what he'd rather face is that possible death at the hands of the Raka than to face Ayarsa and being known by the god of this realm. And so even as he's going all the way, he's fluctuating between this sense of fear. Like he's feeling, again, as you said, you talked about the kind of topographical landscape tie where he's moving up in these mountains, and he's feeling, the further he gets away from the ground, sometimes he's feeling more like he's supposed to feel, but he's going back and forth. He has the fears of what are these creatures going to be like, and then he realizes that they're not really fearful but grotesque. They're not really dangerous. They're helpful. I sense a bond, even to the point by the end he sees men as the strange looking ones. When Weston and Divine come back in at the very end, they're odd looking to him. He sees them as a resident, as a native of Malacandra, not as a native of Thilcandra. But he's always fluctuating between these points, and it's not until, I guess, that he actually sits down face to face, and this is where another, and I do mean it this time, another Lewis reference comes in with his Till We Have Faces, this idea of what is it like to actually meet your maker. So in Till We Have Faces, we get this opportunity that we see in close detail, but he's not meeting his maker, he's meeting Ayarsa, but that fear of being seen, watched, and known truly is sort of a fear that he's dealing with most of the second half of the book.
Yeah, and judged too, right? So is he or is he not, or to what extent is he responsible for the death of Hyoe? And that's a kind of, it would be fun to go through here and think through each experience that he has as part of the path by which he's grown into a man, but being forced publicly to stand for the consequences of your actions. And it's interesting, the judgment of Maladil is, you're not a bad guy, you just have a problem with fear. Isn't that funny? It's like, you're gonna have to deal with that. And that's what I think when he says, yeah, this is gonna either make you mad or mad. I don't know, maybe I'm conflating some of these scenes.
Dr. Shoemaker, when I was reading through this book, a lot of the metaphors and somewhat even the plot reminded me a lot of the Tao Te Ching in terms of conceptualizing space, the metaphor of the river being prevalent in the whole process. So I didn't know if that was just because I had too much cold medicine before reading, but I don't know if C.S. Lewis has a connection to that, but it seemed I was surprised because the story felt more Eastern philosophy than Western.
Yeah, I think I'd have to reread it. My general sense is that there is a kind of natural standard, but that courage is kind of the opposite of the Taoist approach, is that it's wu wei, that you're like the grass and the wind, and you gain power through yielding and so forth. So I don't know, that's intriguing. I have to think about that. But it's the development of courage is, it's inextricably tied to conflict and confronting conflict in a way that makes me think less about the Tao Te Ching. But I'd be open to it.
I would say the difference between the two is C.S. Lewis is more focused on, okay, you can't control circumstances, but you still have to act, where the Tao is more, you can't control circumstances, so the best action is non-action.
Yeah, could be.
Okay.
Intriguing.
I was just curious. I don't want to go down that rabbit trail too much.
When he does get to meet Ayarsa, Ayarsa, pointedly asks him, why are you so afraid? Or what, I think he says, what are you afraid of? And he says, well, I'm afraid of you. And he says, well, why? He says, well, you're not like me, and I can't see you. And this idea of having to see the one, and sight and vision of the elders comes up like pretty early on. He sees a Hrossa cub talking with something. He says, "What are you talking to?" He says, "Oh, you can't see this, the elder." And he thinks that, oh, well, these people are very low intellectually, because see, they have superstitious beliefs about what goes on in the world. And as it turns out, the more he gets to experience Malacandra truly, in actuality, the more he comes to get ability to see the spirit world. So that the most enlightened that he becomes is when he can actually see. It's more, and it's not seeing, I think, in the sense realm, because there's kind of this conflict between the senses and the seeing. So I don't think it's the sense of sight per se. It's a different, it's elevated. You know, that's another aspect of this book. I think Lewis has more to say about it than what we can really even just grasp. He's just touching on things that he's written about in other places, but the sensible world having sort of less to offer than the spiritual world. And like the human senses have an inability really to comprehend so many things, but then it's those exact things, what we can see, what we can know about the world, about the universe, that causes us to be so confident that that worlds beyond those five senses can't exist, and that makes anyone who believes in those superstitious. So he's kind of critiquing this sensibleness, all the while he is finding his Ransom becoming more like a true Malacandran the more that he finds and discovers. And so I guess there's a couple things we've talked about, not this week, but last, I think the mention of we get the humanism and materialism represented there in his traveling companions. And so, yeah, I was wondering if you saw within this that as Ransom becomes more attuned with Malacandra and Malacandrians, that all of the species that are there he meets and interacts with, and grows to find some amount of not only ability to communicate, but some sort of common bond with all of them. What is it about this do you see, or did you perceive when you read it, that is making him see the spirit realm? Is that a good way to phrase that, or is there a sense where I need to say that in a totally different way? You're muted, Aaron.
What's the point in the story when he's thinking about the fact that he can't see the Elel, and it may not be that it's less real, but that it's more than real? That what do you remember? Is it when he's climbing up the mountain alone that he's thinking about it?
Yes, I believe that's right, because he is on the verge of being very fearful, but then also getting kind of a second wind in his climb about the sense that there's a difference between kind of going to meet your maker and you're on a boat that's sinking versus being on a horse where you're in control. And he kind of draws the distinction between those two ideas, where, yeah, he may indeed. And he says, you know, if I didn't hear that one thing, I may still be superstitious about this, but I know I heard the voice. So even though he didn't see, he heard something. So there's some evidence that's confirming to him that he ought to go on. And but yeah, I think that is where that one turn happens. Yes.
I think the passage you mentioned, Micah, is really helpful too, if we keep going from there. But when he says you were afraid because you can't see me and you're different, and then he calls his bluff. It's not bluff. That's not a good way to put it. He just says that's BS. It's not true. And then he leaves it hanging. You know, he says, these are not the real reasons. Ransom said nothing. And then he goes on explaining. And, you know, it leaves you pondering, well, what is the real reason then? You know, and I mean, how can you not think of those two reasons as having a parallel with God? You know, why do you fear God. Well, God's not like me, and I can't see him. And from that perspective, you could see that that's actually not the human. That's not the human reasoning, right? Those aren't the reasons why you fear God. So I was wondering whether this connects. And then he goes on to talk about on the next page for us, 110. He goes into this very thing about the nature of the heavens and the kind of the hierarchy of reality and so forth. But I was wondering whether the unspoken reason is the modern scientific superstition. So these things, I think, keep pushing us back to consider, tease out what's the contents of that modern scientific superstition.
Is our superstition that we're it? We are the thing that must go on and the thing that must be preserved at any cost?
Yeah, I wonder if the superstition is the difference between augury and Weston. If you take science plus modern superstition, you get Weston. If you get pure science, you get the Seroni. And you combine that maybe with science fiction. Maybe those are the two components of it. So you get all these stories that have captured the imagination about what these aliens are like. And if there's a superhuman intelligence, it has to be evil. It's got to bug arms, it's got creepy thing. So I just wonder whether, because you're left to ask, what is it, right? What's the content? What is it? Or in other words, why is it that Ransom is afraid of Oyarsa? And it looks like that his imagination is shaped by two things, and science fiction would be one, which then tells you all about the nature of the heavens as space. And then science does the same thing. It drains the known universe of the possibility of superhuman intellect that's benign, and that in fact deserves to rule and order human affairs, right?
Does Ransom fear Oyarsa? It's partly true because he can't see him and he's not him. He's different. But what's unspoken is that I always imagine the things that I can't see to be evil and bad, and don't realize it's the other. Well, because he's from a bent planet and he's still a bent man, that no, the thing to be feared is myself, and that actually there are things outside me to be trusted. But he hadn't realized that before.
Yeah, it's just curious. How do you what is the pre-modern mind? What does it look like? And I think Lewis has a really nice way of capturing it. That the postmodern scientific mind looks up and sees vast distances, and the pre-modern mind sees height. That's somehow the real difference.
Further up and further in.
Yeah, elevation. As you look up. Modern man he doesn't look up, he looks out. And you're the deadening. We talked about it last week, didn't we? About how then there is no privileged part of the universe anymore. And there's just.
Well, if you're only looking out, you yourself are the center.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah, like you said, I think you said it last week, Aaron. Like there's kind of a new geocentric universe. Only it's the individual in the center of it, and then everything else is rotating and orbiting around it. Yeah,
I like that. That's got a ring to
it. Something that just came up when you said that, talking about kind of the comparison between Yale Gray and Weston, because the other aspect of this is, so Weston has Weston has, of course, a philosophical point of view in which he is not ashamed to share.
Yep.
He also does not fear death. He says again and again in the chapter where he's brought before him, he has zero fear of death. So here's your manly man. He's doing all the things that he's supposed to be doing, and yet he is bad. He is extremely bent, and not broken, but bent. And so, but noticing how he and Agre differ are, on the one hand, Agre has the ability to speak scientifically, but also philosophically, in a way that those two, and spiritually, I would say, in a way that those don't conflict with each other. But the spirit realm is absent from Weston. Weston can speak philosophically and scientifically, but can't see or understand anything about the spiritual realm. And so I think that's something very much in modern science, is not in any faculty departments in academia, but I understand that this is a big problem in finding, even just Christian faculty who can be all of those three: scientists and philosophers, and also Christians, spiritual beings, and can combine all three of those. Is very hard in this kind of postmodern world.
It was interesting when you were talking about the Soren. So we had a couple of scientists on the cruise ship when we were going through, I can't remember the name of the one glacier, seems to be a pattern, but also we were in Glacier Bay, and someone in the audience was asking what is the effects of global warming on the glaciers. And both of them, it was interesting, their tone of humility was different. And they said these glaciers have been receding for 11,000 years. So it's kind of hard to say that we're the cause, right? Which you don't read that in any literature, see that elsewhere. But it was interesting that the way they talked or spoke was much more moderated, and I found it interesting because there was a combination of the philosophical and the science at the same time. Like, this is what is, and these are questions like we need to deal with as humanity in terms of how we live and interact. That I've not heard from that community. So it had two, Micah. It had two of the three things that you were talking about.
I was thinking about the Sorens being the philosophers. I didn't think of them as the scientists, but I think it's because maybe I have a different understanding or a different usage of the word science. But I just wanted to bring up the moment that Ransom gets to the top of the mountain and he finds the Soren in a cave, and he sees the shadow first and then the real thing. And that seemed to me like a really quick allusion to Cave, which made me peg him as a philosopher. I don't know. Was I sniffing the right thing? And can anybody take it further?
Well, little one.
Smell on this little one.
Thank you.
Just don't.
I wish that pun was intended. I wish that pun was
Oh
intended.
man, I thought it was. You should have said
No, I'm
anything.
sorry.
You should have owned that.
I'll be honest.
Oh man.
I know it's because my husband always says, "Are you smelling what I'm stepping in?"
Ah.
Are you catching what
I can hear him say it.
Yeah,
You
can
still
you?
love your husband to say that.
That's gold. That's really good. Well, here's the thing, right? If you go back to, no, I think you're onto it. I think you're right. Lewis says at the end of Abolition of Man that the fundamental transition in the perspective of what the Western world, modern world, is that you went from natural philosophers to modern scientists, and what
so
that
we
means.
just went back.
Well, yeah. So I might have said that wrong, but you go from natural philosophers in the ancient world And the key is then that what's your intent? And the natural philosopher intends to know, and that's sufficient. I think that's what I think that's what the Seroni are. They have no desire to convert their knowledge into power. And then, of course, then the modern scientists, they're no longer content with knowing. And this is why he associates science with alchemy and magic. That science is the alchemy that worked. Alchemy is the science that didn't work and dies out. But they're second cousins. They're or whatever.
To connect to that idea of what you said, I think it's the harnessing of science and turning it into technology. Yeah, that idea there again, very prevalent in Weston. I think you see because Ransom goes and he's like at ground level with all of the species in the culture, and he interacts with them via his mode of learning itself is communication, and he communicates with them, but he appears to be learning for the sake of learning, for understanding. He seeks to understand something about them, and they're seeking to understand something about him. But then that's kind of contrasted with, what do we want to know about this planet for the sake of material gain? Get that in Devon. And then what do we want to? We want to know not only how to get to this planet and take over it, but how to jump from this planet to another planet in the future for the next time that our world, for the next world that we need to go to. So we get this. I think it's really the thing I'm taking away from this right now is that it's the combination of not harnessing for the sake of knowing, and I think that's there in the Abolition too. The understanding of something for the sake of understanding it. There's something valuable in and of that, rather than what material gain or what transformation am I going to make with this knowledge? Those two are coming into better focus now. I do want to be conscious of everyone's time here, and I'd love if anyone else had anything else to say, but I did have one last thing here toward the end of the book that I thought worth mentioning. So does anyone else have things that they wanted to bring up, and then I can save mine for at the end or bring it up next week?
I was curious, did you get more? Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, I have to leave in like 5 minutes. The only question I had is what on earth was going on in the last chapter? That kind of like blew my mind. Where all of a sudden now C.S. Lewis is also a character in the story.
Pretty Stephen King-ish, right?
That seems like a question that we can take up maybe next week.
Yeah.
Seems like that would naturally lead us into, because it's bigger. It seems to be bigger than the novel.
Yep.
Do we get more of the Pfifltriggi people in the next books? Because they seem, they're kind of on scene for 3 seconds.
We don't. We're on a new planet, and so we don't get much of them. Yeah, they certainly get the least amount of attention.
I can tell you they're not in Paralandra.
That's
Read that one.
We don't have more time to talk about them because it's to me it's a fascinating vision of techne or art and making. There's a lot of really good stuff there, but not particularly inspiring. None of us want to be snuffleupaguses with reptile. I think Tim said that right last week. That was perfect.
It's interesting to me that each of the species that we actually get a lot of time with, so the Hrossa and the Seroni, they seem to be more complete, right? So we just listed out with the Sorn, they're scientific and they can speak to philosophical and spiritual matters. And the Hrossa, they're kind of the farmers, food providers, they're poets, but they're also martial in the sense that they will go out and attack the fish thing. What was that? The Harakra? Yeah. And is that in and of itself, is that pointing to a pre-modern man as opposed to a postmodern where we're so dialed in scientifically that we study more and more and more about less and less and less. So we're also specialized in our fields that we can't speak to anything else, or will refuse to speak to anything else. Much like cosmologists don't want to talk about anything philosophical, lest that mess with their theories of how the galaxy began. And so everything is divided, but that is actually harming knowledge, and it's harming man, as opposed to, you know, the heavens declare the glory of God, and that's the heavens, and it's not just vast empty space and nebulas and supernovas and all this other stuff. Is there anything to that with these characters being so fully developed and Ransom interacting with them as he goes along and kind of picking that up as he goes?
I'll put in my 2 cents. Lewis is the patron saint of classical education. Classical education is about the integration of all of the fields of knowledge in such a way that one ought not be cordoned off and separated from another, but one feeds off of and builds on the knowledge that's available from the other. So I think you're right in seeing the connection between, yes, the techne, the Cynthia, and the other one, the other Latin word, Ty's disease has passed on to me. But
I didn't get a classical education, so I don't know.
Yeah. So you're seeing the relationship and the close harmony again. That, as someone else mentioned, these are not in conflict with each other. Species exist under the rule of the theology, and for lack of a better term, and so they all serve their part within and under that sphere. So I think you're right to see that, Josh.
You want to wrap this up, Micah?
Sure. What do you think? And this is maybe something to think on. If anyone has to go, you can go, but maybe something to bring up as the feed for the start of the conversation next week. She had mentioned earlier, you know, Ransom's choice to go back home, but there is an interesting thing going on in this at the end, which on the one hand, he does say, so there's Weston's comment about what's better than to see your own species survive and continue onward. You know, sort of this idea of love of one's people group. Maybe you get that sense there. But race you could bring into it. You could take it a lot of different ways. And Ransom says to Hrossa at the end, he's like, "You're right. This is not." And Hrossa corrects Weston, saying, "You know, you're pursuing this one law, which is not the greatest law, at the expense of all the other ones." And Ransom, when given the choice whether he'll stay in Malacandra or go back to Pfifltriggi with these 2 people who ostensibly would try to kill him on the way back, who already tried to kill him by bringing him there in the first place, who clearly have philosophies so divergent from his own that these are not people you want to spend any amount of time with, let alone 90 days. And he still chooses to go back. And he says, as his defense, "I know you said this is not the first and greatest law, but it is still a law." And that Ransom still desires the things of humankind. What he longs for while on Malacandra is tea and beer and conversation with people who speak his own language. And I wonder what that, in the midst of all of this other conversation about that if things are otherworldly and without our senses, the things that are of sense, that are really what's going on beneath the surface. What is it about the senses that still allow Ransom to find good in them and want to go back and spend time with those people? As he says, if I can't live where I belong, it's better to not live at all. What's your take on that perspective at the very end?
I realized I would have failed my judgment. I would have thought, I'm Doc Brown. I like the 18 whatevers. I'm staying here. I found home. Yeah, that floored me. And of course, that was the right thing to do. I would have muffed it.
There was a little, I don't know if you caught the Doc Brown reference or not, but Back to the Future, everyone, in case you're not well versed, watch that movie before we get back together again so you can understand Aaron's reference.
Whole trilogy, right?
Yeah, watch all of them. The first one and the third one are better than the second one. But anyway, you know.
True.
Well, this also seems like extremely fertile question. maybe we can ponder and talk about next. I think it's really good. It's essentially affirming the goodness of humanity and maybe humanness and one's own. And so, yeah, I think it's a wonderful question to raise.
Well,
I have
then let's-
been an honor learning from all you guys.
Need to
Good to see you.
Yep. So next week we're starting Paralandra, and probably should make it a requirement. Oh, Ty just left. Well, we should probably make it a requirement, right, Shu? We should make everyone read Abolition. It's not that terribly long. We should probably make everyone read that in the midst of this. Not make, of course, we're not forcing you, but you should do it for your own good. And I think it would greatly benefit your reading of That Hideous Strength to have read Abolition and have that conversation going on in the midst of this one. It'd be really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Sounds good.
Kind of a cheat sheet.
Is there any Lewis book that it's not helpful to have abolition of in the background?
Yeah.
Good question.
Uh,
Probably. All right, I gotta go. Have a
Okay.
good night.
same.
All right. Thanks, everyone. All right.
Have a good night.
See you next week.
We'll see you.
All right. See ya.
Good night, everybody.